as I said with swords, when I brought swords up as a map or as a grouping, there's no such thing as a beginner. So the point with tarot is you do have to learn the meanings of every card individually. Then with the process of doing, it's like with anything, like driving a car or with any form of even speed reading, you just get snapped. And not only will you just get snapped, you'll also get extras. And this is it's almost impossible to describe this, because the moment you're sitting with another person, as I think I've mentioned before in one of the videos, you become a triage. There's you, there's the person you're with, and there's tarot, and they're all now one thing, and transference does take place. I'd had a real estate agent break into the Tasmanian market by the real estate agents, go figure. I had the third real estate agent in a row. I got an email from them. They wanted to book their daughter in, who just had a birthday, and she's 22. And that person came yesterday. But the interesting thing about the real estate agent, the third one, and they're all talking now, she was shocked. So what she was used to was people doing oracles, and she wasn't used to people doing prophecy. So she sent her daughter along, and her daughter was sitting opposite me yesterday, and I went, and she said, "What are you sniffing?" And I said, "You smell of Melbourne." She said, "I just came back from Melbourne." That was first off. And she said, "How can you smell a city on me?" I said, I can smell a country on you. How does that work? Something, the triage link. Then she's in the middle of shuffling. And I said, "How was Berlin?" And she said, "Oh, I don't know what to do now." She'd been to Berlin, and it was one of her favorite places in the world. So then even just in casual discussion, I'm checking her out, and I'm just sort of not really thinking. And this is really important, to not think. Just let your mind go, and it's almost like free floating. It's very zen in a way. I'm just free floating, and then I glimpsed an Empress card land on the table, and I just looked off to the side, and I started talking about how terrible endometriosis was. And then I went from endometriosis to PCOS, which is polycystic ovary disorder, and she's just been diagnosed a week ago. So what you end up getting is tarot will give you the capacity. Tarot is an external influence, but not, but yes, but not, but yes, but not, but yes. So that was for a whole lot of the discussion, which is for Witchcraft 500, or even when we go further into the fairy in the alley, as to what my theories are regarding us as a species, because I don't at all maintain that we're just another primate. You know, I do think we're a symbiote. So that this merging can take place when neurons touch. And if you stop and think about it, you become too personal, and that personalization traps you inside of yourself, so that you then get scared. And when people get scared, they just look at the cards. And Jackie's cards were there, and as I was looking at Jackie's cards, I was seeing you're gonna be feeling real fucking good, Jackie.
Awesome.
And you've also got to have that sense of objectivity when it comes to other people, knowing that this is going to have an effect on you. But anyway,
I'm still interested in the transference. So I've read in your books, obviously, sorry, when I say that, but I've read in your books that you bathe after reading. Is there any other tips that you can give on
great tip. You want to know what the great tip is? I'm full of shit. There isn't anything you can do to stop the effect. I used to think there was. I used to hope that if I got into running water, I had a shower, I got wet, I was discharging. I mean, it's just all bullshit. I mean, that was like, we can convince ourselves of anything. At one stage in time, I was involved in Wicca, for goodness sakes. I convinced myself that there was a goddess and a god. And of course, that's all just anthropomorphizing that which is something else again, because you can't necessarily trap the mystery. What will happen over a period of years is I'll go from being able to read 5 people in a day to one takes everything out of me. So it's a matter of knowing how sick you can get, how close to the edge, and that's only with the experience, it actually can't be written about and it can't be said. So what I was attempting to do in the books by giving a way of getting rid of the charge or buildup of static was I was crossing my fucking fingers, mate.
Bit irritating sometimes.
But it's really irritating because most of what you're going to pick up is in your body. And then we try and interpret why our bodies are in trauma, why our bodies are going through this experience of gut reaction. That gut reaction, I mean, it's really important to listen to that. And even if we are incorrect in our interpretation of that, it depends on how brainwashed we've been by societal phenomenon. At the moment, the societal in thing is mental illness, in case you haven't noticed. It's very trendy. And I don't think I've had one person under the age of 30 for a reading in over 10 years who hasn't told me they've been diagnosed with ADHD. I don't think I have had one person whose children in the last 10 years haven't been diagnosed with ADHD. Now, what does that tell you? Let's discuss this, because you will find a lot of it. ADHD, I maintain, is an evolutionary leap. How's that for a big statement? And do you want me to explain it more or not?
Yes, I do. Yes.
When you get into studying Gleick and a few other people who are dancing Wuli masters and a lot of the work that's particularly recent on the understanding of genetics and the understanding of epigenetics, Darwinian theory, there's so much more to it. Evolution happens instantaneously. So when you hear people saying, oh, it's evolving from this to that, you know it's full of bullshit. What they mean is it's developing. Evolution is not that. Evolution occurs as a matter of necessity in life. Left brain, if we can sort of get a little bit blah and go left brain, right brain. Left brain is theoretically associated with linguistics, logic, mathematics, reading and writing skills. Right brain is associated with all forms of art, artistic spontaneity, and so on and so forth. We are told that our ancestors were all right-brained, which is how come they would do the cave paintings in Lascaux, in the Pilbara, wherever. A lot of art, then it would transfer across to writing. But I'd like you to understand that writing and reading occurred in the Middle Ages. It came in our era from Latin. The earliest form of writing, of course, is cuneiform in Sumer. And that's been translated in many different forms of writing that went from cuneiform to Syriac. That was an early form of Middle Eastern. From Syriac, there was also Aramaic, which is where we get our alphabet, and our numeric system is all Aramaic. From there, it goes to Greece, from there to Rome, from there across to any form of to Saxon, became English, which is a mishmash. In the Middle Ages in Europe, because nobody knows what was happening in China, nobody knows what was happening in South America, nobody knows what was happening in the Pacific, and nobody knew what was happening in the continent that had once been called Gondwana, was this development of writing and reading that was based on what information the monks in the abbeys had been given or provided, and their ability to interpret that. And this is where life gets very tricky, because Christianity was well and truly established before the 3rd century of the Common Era. And if you look up the Synod of Whitby, there is a person called the Honourable Bede who came across to the east coast of what's now Lancashire, because on the continent, the monks had decided that Easter was going to fall on a particular day, and the Irish were not allowed to have their own idea of Easter. And they were there as a delegation with the military. And if the Irish monks didn't agree to conform to the European standard of Easter, they would be killed by way of a hostile sword. And that's the quote. Now, this is how the uniformity of language into writing became developed and controlled. And it was controlled by the aristocracy and by the church. It wasn't nothing to do with Judaism and nothing to do with Islam, because they have a different kind of language. So we're just sticking within the framework of what has become English. Of course, English didn't happen until much later. In all of the books, it was Latin, because Rome had conquered the known world. And if you're conquered everybody, you've got to use their language, which is unfortunately happening with English at the moment. And you can trace the movement of people by the languages that are being spoken. But English, or the books that were written, were all handwritten on vellum. They were kept in the abbeys, and they were very close up to the aristocracy. The aristocracy were the only people taught to read them, and the aristocracy were heavily Christian. So when you get to the 20th, and of course we had the printing press starting up in the 18th or 19th century, can't remember off the top of my head. And once the printing press started, information that was written became available to a public who couldn't read. So slowly but surely, the introduction of the scholastic processes of A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P became standard. But children right into the 1920s, even the 1930s, and potentially the 1940s, went to school long enough to get to the age of 10 or 11 and then went to work with their families. They didn't learn anymore. They didn't need that. So the reading and writing, as far as being standard, wasn't until much later. Even fairly recently, reading and writing is such a tiny pinprick in the ages of us as a species that its demise, for lack of a better word, is simply the elastic band flicking back. So the arrow's been sent out into the future, and the bow, the arrow's been sent out in the future, and the string's bounced back. And the string that's bounced back is into the right brain. Right brain is artistic, creative, doing, hands, use your hands, all that. So people having difficulties of being classified as having a dysfunction called ADHD is only because they know that school is rubbish. They're sitting there going, why am I sitting down? I need to run, I need to jump, I need to frolic, I need to leap, I need to climb trees. And they're being made to sit still when it's so against us, our nature as an animal, to sit still. We're not cats. We're a hominid, and our need to move around, it's very similar, I suppose. I do a lot of gesturing, because to sit like this is like, what am I doing? I just trap myself in my body. I don't want to do that. So gesturing is also very European, and it's also been suppressed by the church. We're not supposed to do a lot of gesturing. So even when we move our bodies, we're doing a talking, a communication. And 80% of whatever we communicate or whatever we pick up is through the language of people's bodies. Okay. So ADHD isn't a problem. It's a new way of thinking. And because people are looking at screens, a screen is not a piece of paper. So it's not utilizing the red spectrum. A screen is an image. So people who work with computers are working with their right brain, which is image related. Even if you're reading on a screen, it's still an image. It's not black and white. This is an evolutionary leap. The ponderous nature of orthodoxy hasn't caught up with the evolutionary leap. It is seeing this evolutionary leap as dysfunctional. If it had grown up enough to be able to listen to what's happening with people, it would understand, oh, we're the problem, not them. And it would change its dichotomies, and it would change its entire structure to recognize that people don't think in a straight line anymore. They can't be controlled by the cage of orthodoxy. So every second kid is being diagnosed with ADHD. Every second adult's being diagnosed with ADHD. And then they're being medicated to bring them back to a sense of normalcy that isn't normal. There's not the people who can train these people in the arts, not liberally. So this is where community becomes really important, so that you can set up all these programs of training, language, art, creativity that's not available, or is considered, weirdly enough, as a lesser form of education than that of full scholastics and university, whereas in actual fact, full scholastics and university aren't achieving anything. All it's doing is creating enemies. And I could look at several of you and know exactly what I'm saying. And you know exactly what I'm saying. On the day when I do a reading, it's not negotiable, because there's something else that's happening besides me giving an interpretation of one or two or three cards. When tarot makes a statement, it will be absolutely exclusive to that person, and anybody else making a statement it'll be important to that person. But again, there's a sense of Fight Club in this always. And what's the first rule of Fight Club? We don't talk about Fight Club. And what's also really important is the sense of intimacy that occurs when only one person is interpreting and there's nothing else. Now, what will happen with that interpretation is not anything to do with the reader. That's the twist. Nothing to do with the interpretation. When a person is getting a reading done, they're going to think all kinds of, this means that, and this means that, and this means something else. They can't know what it's going to be. So it can be discussed liberally, but that's irrelevant to the process. When the event occurs, that's when the person will come back to you and tell you this is what happened. I think I've given enough descriptions in the past, haven't I, for that to have sunk in. But again, places and self, because tarot doesn't always differentiate between place and self. If it thinks you are ugly, it will tell you, and you will experience a sensation of ugliness. If you have experiencing the sensation of beauty, you will experience a sensation of beauty. Like Joanne got those three cards, and that's her experience of beauty. And those three cards also, you'd be looking at the Rocky Mountains, you'd be looking at Iceland, you'd be looking at Inishmore off the west coast of Ireland, places, you'd be looking at the Tarkeen in Tasmania, places that are pretty much unpolluted by the domestication of other places. So that's why I call it feral beauty. Yeah, rather than beauty that's stylized by an architect who's got an idea of what they think beauty is. It could also represent things like the Fibonacci sequence or the golden ratio, because that's considered the aspect of beauty. It could also be that aspect of feral beauty can also be the distance between the head and the chin, and what's considered to be the dimensions of perfection for a person who's working with art. So again, it's this primal sense. So when you're reading, it's again that primal, and you cannot be attached to what you say to being correct. If you're attached to that, to being correct, then this is what happens with most readers. Initially, they go through the process of fear, unless they're an absolute bitch like I was. But that gave me the start. So it's necessary. And the majority of people that I've taught tarot to are too afraid to do it, in case they hurt somebody's feelings, or in case they're wrong, or they can get freaked out by a Ten of Swords, freaked out by a Death card, freaked out by a Five of Pentacles, freaked out by a Two of Swords. All kinds of things can freak you out in tarot. And well, they should, because it does take a gutsy person to come for a prophecy.
Cards jump out sometimes when you're shuffling. Does that happen to your clients? And when that does happen, what do we do? Ask them to do?
I usually wait until they've jumped out 3 times. And they will.
Okay.
Very similarly,
Yeah.
in maps, the maps will repeat and repeat and repeat, but they'll repeat in such a way as they'll give you a different perspective, slight variation of what they're saying, but it'll happen every single map over and over again. That the tarot will give you the same information. It's actually quite perverse and bizarre when you look at it, and you think,
Yeah.
there's 7 cards in here, and how is it possible when that person's done this really radically bloody good shuffle that the same information. One of the maps that I do, which is every 7th card, which means that they're shuffling and they're discarding 6 and laying out the 7, that'll still come up and repeat itself in 3 maps.
Yeah.
It shouldn't be able to happen, but it's a whole other story of symbiosis between sort of like ourselves and forever. But it's also interesting when it comes to reading, insofar as you could lay out 3 cards for one person and say, boom, And the next person would lay out the same 3 cards and it would actually be different. But 3 cards is 3 cards. It's like a small sentence. It doesn't tell you much about what's really going to be going on. It's just a snapshot. Yeah. To be able to do a proper reading requires a lot of maps, and your brain to be able to memorize the whole of everything you're reading. And then in the background, you've got an abacus that's lining it all up, and it's lining it up in patterns, and those patterns are being interpreted in the background of consciousness, while in the foreground you're looking at what appears to be sort of like a couple of bits of paper on a table. And if you get a chance to read a book by a person called Greg Bear, and even though it's a fictionalized book, some lore or myth, if you like, it's not non-fiction. It's just a more interesting way of giving us knowledge. So it's packaged in a story that imitates life, but it doesn't always work that way. Greg Bear went to university, he's an author, yes, and he went back to university to study genetics to be able to write his book, Darwin's Radio. And the story of Darwin's Radio is almost like watching COVID-19 unfold, because in Darwin's Radio, well, I can backtrack before that to what was happening with the Zika virus in Brazil. Remember that? Does anybody remember that? Or has it been forgotten so easily? Isn't it easy to forget these things? All of these children being born with partial brains. In 1 year, it was nonstop. And it was considered the Zika virus. So then we got hit with another virus, which is really rather interesting. Because if we can remove the ordeal with COVID is so tragic and look at the actual evolutionary function that's taking place here, it's quite interesting. So in Darwin's Radio, the premise of the story is all these children started getting born with mottles, discolorations, and they couldn't speak. They made sounds in their throats and through their noses, but they didn't speak. And immediately the government, because once 1, then 2, then 10, then 20, and then 2000, once it got to that, the authorities in this story realized that we were in the midst of an epidemic of disease that's happening to all these children. And so it starts to, first of all, hospitalize and segregate the children and the parents. And it went from there to organizing reservations where they would be imprisoned so that they didn't spread. And in the story, one of the geneticists in one of the laboratories, she got pregnant. She was part of this whole spearhead of research into this dilemma. Intuitively, she took off, she ran. And she goes into this very, very, very distant desert area of Arizona or New Mexico or somewhere, very, very away from technology, very much away from any authority body, Badlands, in other words. And she ended up in a community when her child was born, and her child was born with mottles and would make the clicking throat sounds and the nasal whistles, etc. She kept isolated, and she kept her child isolated to be able to stop anybody knowing that her child had the virus, until her child was old enough to become involved in the community. And then when the child went to the community school, all the children there already of the Indigenous people all had mottles, and they all communicated with these throat sounds and these nasal whistles, etc. What it was an evolutionary leap that was initially thought of by authority that condones the concept of orthodoxy and normalcy, and any deviation from orthodoxy and normalcy has to be a disease instead of a leap. I'd like you to consider that, just basically because everything is not necessarily as we perceive it according to the media. And tarot will very much, not only tarot, but magic informs about this, because the patterns of magic have been available to us to, like biblical texts, to look at as observers from a different lens to that of academia, and to completely change our minds to the idea of who we are, and what we are becoming. And I think this becomes a constant awareness, because if you slip back into the idea of society's culpability of that which is considers deviant, you'll get depressed, and your adrenals will go into overload, and you'll end up with adrenal fatigue, and you'll end up being susceptible to all kinds of disorders that are trying to make you die because you didn't listen in the first place. And your body will want to die because it's shriveling, and it's shriveling because of a lack of communication with self and environment and ecology.